A service dog refused to enter the hospital room, and when nurses followed him, they discovered the terrifying truth. In a place where healing is supposed to happen, one loyal companion sensed something sinister lurking just beyond the door. With lives hanging in the balance and a predator hiding in plain sight, this is the story of how a dog's instinct exposed a terrifying truth that the hospital had desperately tried to hide. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar, almost hypnotic tune as Nurse Emily checked her watch. 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in late October. St. Jude's Hospital was just beginning to stir from its early morning lull. The night shift, preparing to hand off to the day staff with tired smiles, exchanged notes, and the ever-present lukewarm coffee that seemed to be a hospital staple. The hallways were quieter now, before the chaos of the day truly began. Before the surgeries, the emergencies, the endless stream of patients who needed care. Emily had been working these halls for 8 years, and in that time, she'd learned something invaluable. Trust your gut. It had saved her more than once. There had been moments when she'd insisted on additional tests for a patient everyone else thought was fine, only to discover a hidden infection or a developing complication. There had been times when she'd sensed a family member's distress before they'd even spoken a word, allowing her to offer comfort in ways that went beyond standard medical protocol. Her intuition was a sixth sense, honed by years of experience, observation, and genuine care for the people under her watch. She pushed the medication cart down the corridor, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished linoleum floor. The cart was laden with small paper cups containing various medications: pain relievers, antibiotics, anti-anxiety medications, each one representing a patient's journey toward healing. Room 412 was her next stop, and Emily found herself smiling slightly as she approached it. Room 412 belonged to Tom, a regular fixture on the trauma ward, though regular didn't quite capture the complexity of his situation. Tom was a survivor, in every sense of the word. 3 years ago, he'd been the victim of a brutal attack that had nearly cost him his life. The physical wounds had healed relatively well. The surgeons at St. Jude's were skilled, and modern medicine had worked its miracles on his broken bones and lacerated flesh. But the invisible wounds, the psychological scars, the PTSD, the nightmares that still jolted him awake in the dead of night, those were far more difficult to heal. Tom had spent months in therapy, learning to navigate a world that suddenly felt dangerous and unpredictable. He'd struggled with anxiety, with trust, with the simple act of being alone in a room without feeling like the walls were closing in. And then he'd gotten Max. Max was a golden retriever service dog with soulful amber eyes and an uncanny ability to sense when Tom's anxiety was spiraling before Tom himself even realized it. The dog had been specially trained to recognize the physical signs of a panic attack. The shallow breathing, the tensing muscles, the way Tom's hands would clench into fists. When Max sensed these signs, he would press against Tom's leg, grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Max had become more than a pet. He was Tom's lifeline, his anchor to normalcy, his constant companion through the darkest hours. Emily had grown genuinely fond of both of them over the months they'd been coming to St. Jude's for follow-up appointments and occasional overnight stays when Tom's anxiety became too much to manage at home. Max would greet her with a gentle tail wag every morning, his presence a calming force in a unit filled with pain, suffering, and the constant hum of medical equipment. Tom would smile, a real smile, not the forced kind that patients often wore for their nurses whenever she entered his room. It was genuine, warm, and it made Emily's job feel worthwhile. But this morning felt different. There was something in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that Emily couldn't quite articulate, but could definitely feel. As Emily rounded the corner toward room 412, she saw Max in the hallway, his leather leash held loosely by Tom's visitor, a family friend named David, who visited regularly and had become something of an uncle figure to Tom. The dog was supposed to be with Tom, as he always was during these hospital stays. Service dogs were rarely separated from their handlers, and Tom's anxiety spiked whenever Max was out of his immediate vicinity. Emily's instincts prickled with concern. Something was wrong. "Good morning, Max," Emily said warmly, expecting the usual enthusiastic greeting, the tail wag, the gentle nudge, the soft whine of recognition that had become part of her morning routine. "How's my favorite boy doing today?" Max didn't move. His entire body had gone rigid, his golden fur seeming to stand on end, as if he'd received an electric shock. His amber eyes were fixed intently on the open doorway of room 412, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from deep within his chest, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his being. Emily had never heard him make a sound like this before. In all the months she'd known Max, he'd been nothing but gentle, calm, and well-mannered. This was completely out of character. She froze mid-step, her medication cart coming to an abrupt halt. Service dogs didn't behave this way without reason. They were trained extensively to be calm, controlled, and protective without being overtly aggressive. They were trained to help their handlers, not to threaten. But Max's stance screamed danger in a language that transcended words. His muscles were coiled like springs, ready to pounce at a moment's notice, and his lips had pulled back slightly, revealing his teeth in what could only be described as a warning snarl. Emily's heart began to race, her pulse quickening as adrenaline flooded her system. She'd been trained to remain calm in medical emergencies. But this was different. This was instinctual, primal, and deeply unsettling. "Max?" Emily approached slowly, her voice gentle but cautious, her nurse's intuition kicking into overdrive. Every sense was now heightened, every nerve ending alert. "What's wrong, boy? What is it?" The dog didn't acknowledge her presence. His entire focus remained fixed on the room, as if he were standing guard against some unseen threat. He took a deliberate step backward, his body language unmistakably communicating refusal. He would not enter that room. Another growl, deeper this time, more insistent, more primal. Emily's heart began to pound in her chest. She looked at David, whose face had gone noticeably pale beneath his tan. His hands were trembling slightly as he held Max's leash, and his eyes darted between Emily and the dog, with growing alarm. "Has he been like this the whole time?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread that was settling in her stomach like a stone. "No," David stammered, his voice shaky and uncertain. "He was fine until about 10 minutes ago. We were just standing here waiting for you to come by, and he just stopped. His whole body went stiff, and then he started acting like this. I've never seen him behave this way before. I don't know what's wrong with him. Should I try to get him to go inside?" "No," Emily said quickly, more forcefully than she'd intended. Something in her gut told her that Max's refusal was important, that it meant something. "No, don't force him. Just keep him here for a moment." Emily didn't hesitate any longer. She moved past Max and stepped into room 412, her eyes immediately scanning the space for Tom. He was in the bed, propped up on several pillows, but something was terribly, obviously wrong. His face was ashen, almost gray in color, as if all the blood had drained from his features. His hands trembled visibly as they gripped the hospital sheets with white-knuckled intensity. The fabric bunched and wrinkled beneath his shaking fingers. His breathing was shallow and rapid. The breathing of someone in acute distress, someone whose nervous system was in overdrive. "Tom?" Emily rushed to his bedside, her professional training taking over as she shifted into nurse mode. Her eyes scanned his body for signs of physical injury or medical emergency. "Are you in pain? What's happening? Should I call for a doctor?" Tom's eyes were wide, almost wild, darting frantically toward the doorway where Max continued to stand sentinel, his growl still audible from the hallway. Tom's gaze was filled with a fear so profound that it made Emily's blood run cold. "He knows," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with barely suppressed terror. "He knows something's wrong. Max always knows. He can sense things that we can't." Emily's mind raced through possibilities, running through a mental checklist of potential medical emergencies. Was Tom having a cardiac event? A stroke? A panic attack? She reached for his wrist to check his pulse, her fingers finding the artery and counting the rapid beats. His heart was racing, his pulse elevated far beyond normal range. His skin was clammy and cold to the touch. But Tom grabbed her hand with surprising strength, his fingers digging into her skin with desperation. "It's not me," he said, his voice trembling with an emotion that went beyond physical pain. "It's not a medical emergency. It's him. Room 414, 2 doors down. Emily, he's in room 414. Emily's blood ran cold, turning to ice in her veins. Room 414. The room that had been occupied for only 3 days. The room that had been the subject of whispered conversations among the nursing staff. Conversations that would stop abruptly whenever she approached. The room that housed a patient she'd been briefed on during shift change. A patient whose file she'd tried to forget, whose history had made even the most seasoned nurses uncomfortable, whose presence seemed to cast a shadow over the entire ward. Max's refusal suddenly made horrifying, undeniable sense. "Tom, what do you mean?" Emily asked, though part of her already knew the answer, or at least suspected it. "What happened?" "He came to my door last night," Tom whispered, his words tumbling out in a rush of fear and desperation. "When it was late, when the hallways were quiet, he came to my door and he looked at me through the window. And then he knocked. He knocked on my door, Emily, and he said he'd been watching me. He said he knew I was here. He said he remembered me. From before. From 3 years ago." Emily felt the color drain from her own face as the implications of his words sank in. "He said he'd come back for me," Tom continued, his voice breaking. "He said this wasn't over between us. Emily, I'm scared. I'm terrified. Max won't go in that room because he knows. He can sense it. He knows that man is dangerous. He knows that something terrible is about to happen." Emily's hands went cold, her professional composure beginning to crack at the edges. In her 8 years at St. Jude's, in all her years of nursing experience, she'd never encountered anything quite like this. A service dog's refusal to enter a room wasn't just unusual. It was extraordinary, significant. A warning written in body language that transcended human communication. And warnings from animals, Emily had learned through years of observation, should never be ignored. Animals possessed instincts that humans had largely lost, a connection to danger and threat that modern civilization had dulled in people but never extinguished in creatures like Max. She looked back toward the doorway, where Max remained frozen in his protective stance, still growling softly, still refusing to cross the threshold, still standing guard over his handler like a sentinel, at the gates of hell. Emily made a decision in that moment. A decision that would set in motion a chain of events that would expose secrets, uncover lies, and reveal a darkness that had been festering within these hospital walls far longer than anyone realized. She would find out exactly who was in room 414. She would discover why a loyal dog's every instinct was screaming that danger lurked just 2 doors away. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. But she had no idea, could never have imagined, that what she was about to uncover would be far worse, far more sinister, and far more dangerous than anything she could have anticipated. The hospital she'd worked in for 8 years, the place she'd thought was a sanctuary of healing, was about to reveal itself as something far more complicated, far more troubling, and infinitely more terrifying. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she stepped out of room 412, closing the door softly behind her. Max immediately pressed against her legs, his body still rigid with tension, his amber eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that was almost unnerving. David stood nearby, confusion and concern etched across his features. But Emily barely registered his presence. Her mind was already racing ahead, already formulating questions that needed answers. She needed to see the file. She needed to know exactly who was in room 414 and why no one had mentioned that this particular patient had any connection to Tom. Hospital protocol required that such information be disclosed, that potential conflicts or dangerous situations be flagged in advance. The fact that this hadn't happened suggested either a serious oversight or something far more deliberate. "David, can you stay with Tom for a few minutes?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside her. "He's upset, and I think he needs someone he trusts nearby. Just sit with him. Don't let him be alone." David nodded, though confusion still clouded his expression. "Of course. But Emily, what's going on? What did Tom tell you?" "I'll explain in a moment," Emily said, already moving toward the nurse's station. "Just stay with him." The trauma ward's central nurse's station was a hub of controlled chaos. Computers beeping, phones ringing, nurses and aides moving between stations with practiced efficiency. Emily made her way to the computer terminal, her credentials allowing her access to patient files. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up room 414's information. The name on the screen made her breath catch in her throat. Marcus Reed. Marcus Reed. The name meant nothing to her at first, but as she scrolled through his file, the pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Admitted 3 days ago. Reason for admission: severe lacerations and blunt force trauma. The official story was that he'd been in an altercation outside a bar, that he'd been the victim of an unprovoked attack. But as Emily read further, she found something that made her blood run even colder. There was a note in his file, a brief, almost cryptic entry from Dr. Patricia Ashford, the attending physician. Patient claims to have prior connection to another patient on ward. Advised patient to have no contact with other patients. Patient became agitated when informed of restriction. Monitor closely. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Prior connection. That was code for something. She was certain of it. She pulled up Marcus Reed's history, scrolling through his medical records, his previous admissions. And then she found it. A reference to an incident 3 years ago. A note in his file that referenced an arrest, a conviction, a sentence. She clicked on the link, and her screen filled with information that made her feel physically ill. Marcus Reed had been convicted of assault 3 years ago. The victim's name was listed as Thomas Mitchell, Tom. The details were sparse in the medical file, but they were enough. Tom had been attacked by Marcus Reed 3 years ago, and somehow, through what could only be described as a cruel twist of fate, They had both ended up in the same hospital ward at the same time. But there was more. As Emily dug deeper into the file, she found something even more disturbing. Marcus Reed's current admission wasn't actually a result of a bar fight. According to a note buried in his file, a note that appeared to have been added recently and marked as confidential. Marcus Reed had been admitted after attempting to break into a residence. The residence belonged to Thomas Mitchell. Emily felt the room spin slightly around her. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something far more sinister. Marcus Reed had deliberately sought out Tom. He had attempted to break into Tom's home, and when he'd been caught and arrested, he'd somehow ended up here in this hospital, on the same ward as his victim. How had this happened? How had the hospital allowed this situation to develop? Surely someone in administration, someone in the system must have caught this. Must have prevented it. Unless they hadn't. Unless someone had deliberately allowed it to happen. Emily's mind reeled with the implications. She needed to talk to Dr. Ashford. She needed to understand why Tom hadn't been moved to a different ward. Why Marcus Reed hadn't been transferred to a different hospital. Why this dangerous situation had been allowed to persist. She stood up from the computer, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her, and made her way toward the doctor's office. Dr. Patricia Ashford had been at St. Jude's for 15 years. She was respected, competent, and by all accounts, deeply committed to her patients' well-being. Emily had always admired her. But right now, Emily needed answers, and she intended to get them. Dr. Ashford's office door was ajar. Emily knocked softly, pushing it open slightly. The doctor was at her desk, reviewing what appeared to be patient files, her reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose. She looked up as Emily entered, her expression shifting from concentration to mild surprise. "Emily," Dr. Ashford said, setting down her pen. "What can I do for you?" Emily stepped inside and closed the door behind her. This conversation needed privacy. "I need to talk to you about room 414, about Marcus Reed." Dr. Ashford's entire body went rigid. Her hand froze in mid-motion and her jaw tightened visibly. She removed her glasses slowly, setting them on the desk with deliberate care. When she looked back at Emily, something had shifted in her expression. Something that looked like resignation, or perhaps fear. "Sit down," Dr. Ashford said quietly. Emily sat, her heart pounding so hard she was certain the doctor could hear it. "How much do you know?" Dr. Ashford asked. "I know that Marcus Reed attacked Tom 3 years ago," Emily said. "I know that Reed was recently arrested for attempting to break into Tom's home. I know that somehow they've ended up on the same ward. And I know that Tom is terrified, and that Max, his service dog, won't even enter the room next to Reed's. So I'm asking you directly, how did this happen? Why hasn't Tom been moved? Why hasn't Reed been transferred?" Dr. Ashford stood up and walked to the window, her back to Emily. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was ordered not to," she said. Emily felt her stomach drop. "Ordered? By whom?" "By hospital administration," Dr. Ashford said, still not turning around. "By people who are far more concerned with liability and public relations than they are with patient safety. 3 days ago, when Marcus Reed was admitted, I immediately flagged the situation. I noted his history, his connection to another patient on the ward, and I recommended that he be transferred to a different facility. I made it very clear that having both the victim and the perpetrator on the same ward created an unacceptable risk." She finally turned to face Emily, and the older woman's face was lined with exhaustion and something that looked like shame. "I was told that transferring Reed would be too complicated," Dr. Ashford continued. "That it would draw attention. That the hospital's insurance and legal team had determined that as long as they were kept in separate rooms and monitored, there was no liability issue. I was told to document the situation and ensure that there was no direct contact between them. I was told that this was temporary, that Reed would be discharged within a week." "That's insane," Emily breathed. "That's completely irresponsible. Tom is traumatized. He's terrified. And now Reed is threatening him, coming to his door." "I know," Dr. Ashford interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. "I know all of this, and I've made my objections clear to administration multiple times. But they're not listening. They're more concerned with avoiding a scandal, with avoiding the appearance of impropriety, than they are with protecting our patients." Emily stood up, her mind racing. "We need to report this. We need to go to the hospital board, to the authorities, to someone. This is a patient safety issue." "I've tried," Dr. Ashford said wearily. "I've filed formal complaints. I've documented everything. But the people in administration, they have power, Emily. They have connections. And they're not interested in hearing about problems that might make the hospital look bad." "So what? We just do nothing?" Emily demanded. "We just let this situation continue? We just hope that Reed doesn't hurt Tom again?" "No," Dr. Ashford said, and there was steel in her voice now. "We don't do nothing. But we have to be smart about it. We have to be careful. Because if we go charging in, making accusations without solid evidence, without a clear plan, we'll lose our jobs, and the situation will still remain unchanged. We need to gather evidence. We need to document everything. And we need to find allies. People within the hospital who share our concerns and who have the power to do something about it." Emily felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. This was bigger than she'd realized. This wasn't just a case of administrative negligence. This was a conspiracy of silence. A deliberate choice to prioritize the hospital's reputation over patient safety. "What do you want me to do?" Emily asked quietly. Dr. Ashford met her gaze directly. "Keep an eye on both patients. Document any interactions, any threats, any concerning behavior from Reed. And talk to the other nurses on this ward. Find out if anyone else has noticed anything unusual. If we're going to expose what's happening here, we need to build an airtight case." Emily nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of what she was being asked to do. She was being asked to become a whistleblower, to risk her career and her reputation to expose what appeared to be a serious breach of patient safety protocols. But as she thought of Tom, terrified in his room, of Max refusing to enter a space where danger lurked, of an entire hospital system that had chosen profit and reputation over the well-being of its patients, Emily knew she had no choice. "Okay," she said. "I'll do it." As she left Dr. Ashford's office and made her way back toward the trauma ward, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far darker and more complex than she could have ever imagined. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that this was only the beginning, that the darkness hiding within these hospital walls ran far deeper than anyone had yet discovered. The rest of Emily's shift passed in a blur of medication rounds, vital sign checks, and careful observation. She moved through the trauma ward with practiced efficiency. But her mind was elsewhere, turning over the information Dr. Ashford had shared, analyzing every detail, searching for patterns and connections that might help build the case they needed. As she made her rounds, Emily found herself paying closer attention to the other nurses, to their reactions when room 414 was mentioned, to the subtle shifts in their body language when they discussed Marcus Reed. She noticed that most of them avoided the room entirely, delegating tasks to the nursing aides whenever possible. She noticed the way conversations would stop abruptly when she approached, as if people were discussing something they didn't want her to hear. By late afternoon, Emily had managed to pull aside one of the senior nurses, Margaret Chen, a woman who had been working at St. Jude's for nearly as long as Emily had. Margaret was sitting in the break room, sipping coffee and reviewing patient charts, when Emily sat down across from her. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" Emily said quietly, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. Margaret looked up from her charts, her expression cautious. She was a perceptive woman, and Emily could see the moment she realized this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Margaret set down her coffee and closed her charts. "Of course," Margaret said. "What's on your mind?" Emily took a deep breath. She needed to be careful here, to feel out whether Margaret could be trusted. "What do you know about Marcus Reed in room 414? Margaret's entire body went tense. She looked around the break room, confirming that they were alone before leaning forward and lowering her voice. "I know that he shouldn't be here," Margaret said bluntly. "I know that he has a history with another patient on this ward. And I know that administration has made it very clear that we're not supposed to talk about it. I also know that Dr. Ashford filed a formal complaint about the situation and was essentially told to drop it." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Margaret knew. More importantly, Margaret seemed to share her concerns. "Have you noticed anything unusual?" Emily pressed. "Any interactions between Reed and Tom? Any threatening behavior?" Margaret's expression darkened. "Actually, yes. 3 nights ago, I was doing a late-night medication round, and I saw Reed standing outside his door, looking down the hallway toward Tom's room. When he saw me, he quickly went back inside. But the way he was looking—" "Emily, it wasn't the look of a patient recovering from injuries. It was the look of someone hunting." Emily's blood ran cold. "Did you report it?" "I mentioned it to the charge nurse," Margaret said. "She told me to document it and move on. She said that as long as Reed wasn't actually entering Tom's room, there was nothing to be concerned about. But I disagree. I think we have a serious problem here, and I think administration is deliberately ignoring it." "Why would they do that?" Emily asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Money," Margaret said bluntly. "Reed's family is wealthy, very wealthy. They hired a private team of lawyers, and apparently they've been pressuring the hospital to keep Reed here rather than having him transferred to a different facility. Something about his condition being too delicate to move, about needing specialized care that only St. Jude's can provide. It's all nonsense, of course. Reed is healing fine. There's no medical reason he needs to stay here. But his family is threatening lawsuits, threatening to pull their donations from the hospital's research programs. And administration has decided that keeping Reed here is less expensive than dealing with the legal fallout of moving him." Emily felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. So this was about money. The hospital was literally choosing to keep a dangerous patient in close proximity to his victim because the patient's family had deep pockets and powerful lawyers. It was unconscionable. "There's something else," Margaret continued, her voice dropping even lower. "Something that I haven't told anyone else yet. 2 days ago, I overheard a conversation between 2 members of the hospital's administrative staff. They were in the hallway near the supply closet, and they didn't realize I was in the room restocking supplies. They were discussing Reed's case, and one of them said something that really bothered me. What did they say? Emily asked, leaning forward. They said that Reed's family had made it clear that if Reed didn't get what he wanted, if he wasn't allowed to finish what he started, then the family would make sure the hospital paid for it. Not legally. They were very careful not to say anything explicitly threatening. But the implication was clear. They were suggesting that Reed's family might be willing to let something happen to Tom, as long as it didn't happen on hospital grounds. Emily felt the room tilt slightly. Are you saying that the hospital administration is facilitating a potential crime? That they're allowing Reed to stay here in close proximity to Tom because Reed's family is essentially threatening them? I'm saying that's what it sounds like to me, Margaret said grimly. And I think we need to be very careful about how we handle this. Because if we start asking too many questions, if we start making accusations, the people in administration might decide that we've become more of a liability than Tom is. Before Emily could respond, the break room door opened, and another nurse, Jessica Torres, walked in. Jessica was younger than Emily and Margaret, only a few years out of nursing school. But she had sharp eyes and a quick mind. She grabbed a coffee from the pot and turned to face them. And Emily immediately saw that something was wrong. Jessica's face was pale, and her hands were trembling slightly. We need to talk, Jessica said, sitting down heavily in the chair next to Emily. All of us. About what's really going on in this hospital. What do you mean? Emily asked, though she had a sinking feeling that she knew exactly what Jessica meant. I mean that I've been doing some digging, Jessica said quietly. After I heard about the situation with Reed and Tom, I got curious. So I started looking into Reed's background, his history, the details of his original crime. And Emily, what I found is much worse than anyone realizes. Margaret and Emily exchanged a glance, and then Margaret gestured for Jessica to continue. Marcus Reed didn't just attack Tom randomly 3 years ago, Jessica said. The attack was premeditated. Reed had been stalking Tom for weeks before the assault. He had a plan. He was going to do something much worse than what actually happened, but he was interrupted by a security guard. Tom survived because he was lucky, because someone happened to be nearby. But Reed's intentions were clear from his diary, which was entered into evidence during his trial. Emily felt her stomach turn. What were his intentions? Murder, Jessica said flatly. Reed planned to kill Tom. He documented it all in his diary, his obsession with Tom, his reasons for wanting him dead, the method he was planning to use. The only reason he didn't succeed was because of that security guard. And when Reed was released from prison 3 years later, he immediately began planning to finish what he started. The implications of this revelation hung in the air, like a dark cloud. Marcus Reed wasn't just a dangerous patient who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a predator, an obsessed stalker, a would-be murderer who had been given a second chance to complete his crime. And the hospital administration, for whatever reason, had chosen to allow him to stay in close proximity to his intended victim. We need to go to the police, Emily said decisively. We need to report this. This is beyond hospital administration now. This is a criminal matter. I agree, Margaret said. But we need to be smart about it. We need to have documentation, evidence, something that will convince the police that this is a legitimate concern and not just hospital gossip. I have something, Jessica said, pulling out her phone. She scrolled through something, then turned the screen to face Emily and Margaret. It was a screenshot of a document, a court filing from Reed's original trial, detailing the contents of his diary and the charges against him. I printed this out and made copies. I also printed out the hospital's admission records for both Reed and Tom, showing that they were admitted to the same ward. And I have Margaret's documentation of the incident she witnessed. Emily felt a glimmer of hope. They had evidence. Not much, but enough to start building a case. Okay, Emily said, thinking through the logistics. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to compile everything we have. All the documentation, all the incidents, all the evidence of administrative negligence. And then we're going to take it to someone outside the hospital. Someone with authority, someone who can actually do something about this. The police? Margaret asked. The police, the state medical board, maybe even the FBI if this involves interstate commerce or conspiracy, Emily said. We're going to blow this wide open, but we need to do it carefully, and we need to do it soon. Because every day that Reed stays on this ward is another day that Tom is in danger. As the three women sat in the break room, making plans and gathering their courage, none of them realized that their conversation had been overheard. In the hallway just outside the break room door, a figure stood in the shadows, listening intently to every word they said. And when the figure heard their plan to go to the authorities, a cold smile spread across their face. The game had just become far more dangerous, and Emily, Margaret, and Jessica had no idea that they had just made themselves targets. The figure in the hallway was David Chen, Margaret's younger brother and a newly hired member of the hospital's administrative staff. David had always been ambitious, always been willing to do whatever it took to get ahead. When he'd been hired by St. Jude 6 months ago, he'd seen it as an opportunity, a chance to climb the corporate ladder, to make connections, to build a career in healthcare administration that would eventually lead to power and prestige. What he hadn't anticipated was becoming entangled in something far more sinister than office politics. David had been present during the initial discussions about Marcus Reed's admission. He'd been in the meeting when the hospital's legal team had presented their analysis. Keeping Reed on the ward was cheaper than transferring him and dealing with the potential lawsuits from his family. He'd heard the calculations, the risk assessments, the cold financial logic that had led to the decision to prioritize profit over patient safety. At the time, David had said nothing. He'd kept his head down, taken notes, and filed the information away. He was still new, still learning how things worked in the hospital's upper echelons. He'd assumed that the decision-makers knew what they were doing, that there was some larger strategy at play that he simply didn't understand yet. But as he'd listened to Emily, Margaret, and Jessica's conversation through the break room door, David had realized something that made his blood run cold. The three nurses were planning to expose everything. They were going to go to the authorities. They were going to bring down the people who had made the decision to keep Reed here. And David had a terrible feeling that his own involvement in those initial meetings would make him complicit in whatever came next. He pulled out his phone and made a call, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for someone to answer. The call went through after 2 rings, and a familiar voice answered. The voice of Richard Hartley, the hospital's chief administrative officer. "David," Hartley said, sounding mildly surprised. "Is something wrong?" "We have a problem," David said quietly, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "A serious problem. 3 nurses just made plans to go to the authorities with information about the Reed situation. They're gathering evidence, documentation, everything. They're planning to expose the hospital's decision to keep Reed on the ward." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. David could almost hear the gears turning in Hartley's mind, could imagine the older man weighing his options, calculating the potential damage. "Who are the 3 nurses?" Hartley asked finally. Emily Richardson, Margaret Chen, and Jessica Torres, David said. Another silence. Then, thank you for letting me know, David. This is helpful information. I'll handle it. What do you mean, you'll handle it? David asked, feeling a flutter of unease in his chest. What are you going to do? Don't worry about it, Hartley said. Just continue doing your job. And David, don't mention this conversation to anyone, not even to your sister. Understood? Understood, David said. But the unease in his chest had grown into something much larger, much darker. He was beginning to suspect that he'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than simple corporate malfeasance. He ended the call and stood in the hallway for a long moment, thinking about what he'd just done. He'd essentially handed over the names of 3 people who were trying to do the right thing. He'd betrayed them to protect himself and his career. And now, whatever happened next, he would be responsible for it. Meanwhile, in his office on the top floor of the hospital, Richard Hartley sat back in his leather chair and stared at the phone in his hand. The situation with Marcus Reed had been carefully orchestrated from the beginning. Hartley had been approached by Reed's family 6 months ago, long before Reed had even been arrested for attempting to break into Tom's home. They'd made him an offer, a very generous offer, to ensure that if Reed ever ended up in a hospital, he would receive preferential treatment and would be allowed to remain in the facility for as long as necessary. Hartley had accepted the offer. The money had been substantial, enough to fund his daughter's college education and provide a comfortable cushion for his retirement. He'd told himself that it was a victimless crime, that he was simply ensuring that a wealthy patient received good care. He'd convinced himself that there was nothing wrong with what he was doing. But now, with 3 nurses threatening to expose everything, the situation had become far more complicated. Hartley needed to think carefully about his next move. He needed to neutralize the threat without drawing attention to himself or the hospital. He picked up his phone again and made another call, this time to a number that wasn't in his official contacts. The person who answered was a man named Victor Delgado, a fixer who had worked with the hospital on several sensitive matters over the years. Victor was the kind of person you called when you needed something handled quietly, discreetly, without official channels or paperwork. I have a situation, Hartley said without preamble. 3 employees are planning to expose some confidential information about the hospital. I need them to be discouraged from pursuing this course of action. Discouraged how? Victor asked, his tone casual, as if Hartley had simply asked him to arrange a catering service. I don't care, Hartley said. Just make sure they understand that going public would be a mistake. A serious mistake. One that would have consequences. Understood, Victor said. It will be done. Hartley ended the call and felt a wave of relief wash over him. Victor was good at what he did. He would handle the situation. The 3 nurses would be discouraged, Emily and Margaret and Jessica would back down, and everything would return to normal. At least, that's what Hartley told himself. Emily left the hospital at the end of her shift, her mind still churning with everything that had been discussed in the break room. She and Margaret and Jessica had made plans to meet the following evening, away from the hospital, to compile all their evidence and decide on their next steps. They would contact a lawyer, someone who specialized in whistleblower cases, and they would figure out the best way to expose what was happening. As Emily walked to her car in the parking garage, she felt a strange prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She quickened her pace, her keys already in her hand, ready to unlock her car. The parking garage was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the rows of vehicles. She was almost to her car when she heard footsteps behind her. Fast footsteps, getting closer. Emily spun around, her heart suddenly pounding in her chest. A figure in dark clothing was approaching her, moving quickly, their face obscured by shadows and the hood of their jacket. "Hey!" Emily called out, backing toward her car. "What do you want?" The figure stopped a few feet away from her, and in the dim light of the parking garage, Emily could just make out the outline of a face. It was a man, muscular and imposing, with cold eyes that seemed to look right through her. "Ms. Richardson," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "I have a message for you. From some people who are very interested in your recent activities." Emily's hand trembled as she fumbled with her car door. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," the man said, taking a step closer. "You and your friends have been asking questions, making plans, talking about going to the authorities. And some very important people would like you to understand that this would be a serious mistake." "Are you threatening me?" Emily asked, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "I'm warning you," the man said. "Drop this. Forget about Marcus Reed. Forget about Tom Mitchell. Forget about everything you think you know. Because if you don't, if you go to the authorities, if you try to expose what's happening in that hospital, there will be consequences. Serious consequences. For you, for your family, for everyone you care about." Emily finally got her car door open and scrambled inside, locking the doors immediately. The man stood outside her window for a moment, watching her with those cold, predatory eyes. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking garage. Emily sat in her car, her entire body shaking, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. This was real. This was actually happening. Someone had sent a man to threaten her, to intimidate her into silence. She started her car with trembling hands and drove out of the parking garage as quickly as she safely could. As she drove home, she kept checking her rearview mirror, convinced that the man in the dark clothing was following her. She didn't feel safe until she was home, her doors locked, her security system armed. She immediately called Margaret. "We have a problem," Emily said without preamble. "A serious problem. Someone just threatened me in the parking garage." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "What? Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" "No, I'm fine," Emily said. "But Margaret, they knew my name. They knew what we were planning. They knew everything. Someone at the hospital told them." "Oh my God," Margaret breathed. "Emily, this is bigger than we thought. This isn't just about hospital administration trying to cover up a mistake. This is organized. This is dangerous." "I know," Emily said, "and I think we need to accelerate our timeline. We need to go to the authorities immediately. Tonight, if possible. Because whoever is behind this, they're clearly willing to use violence to keep us quiet. And I don't think it's going to stop with threats." "Agreed," Margaret said. "Let me call Jessica. We'll meet at my house in an hour. And Emily, be careful. Make sure you're not followed. And lock your doors." Emily ended the call and sat in her living room, surrounded by the familiar comfort of her home, but feeling more vulnerable and exposed than she ever had before. She'd stumbled into something dark and dangerous, something that reached far beyond the walls of the hospital, into the criminal underworld of threats, violence, and corruption. And now, there was no turning back. Emily arrived at Margaret's house, her heart racing. The night was cool, the air crisp with the promise of winter, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was the threat that loomed over her and her friends. As she parked her car, she scanned the street, half expecting to see the same dark figure lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. But the street was quiet. The only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Margaret's house was modest, a charming two-story with white shutters and a welcoming front porch. Emily hurried to the door and knocked, her pulse quickening as she waited for Margaret to answer. A moment later, the door swung open, and Margaret stood there, looking pale but determined. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let Emily pass. "Jessica is already here." Emily stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The living room was warmly lit, a cozy space filled with bookshelves and well-worn furniture. Jessica was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked underneath her, her expression serious. "What's the plan?" Jessica asked, looking up as Emily entered. "We need to come up with a strategy," Emily said, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "We can't just go to the police without solid evidence. We need to gather everything we have and figure out the best way to present it." Margaret nodded, leading them to the dining room table, where a stack of papers lay waiting. "I've compiled everything we discussed earlier, the incident reports, the documentation of Reed's history, and Jessica's findings about his diary. I also pulled together some notes about the conversations I've had with other nurses on the ward. Several of them are concerned, but are too afraid to speak up." "Good," Emily said, feeling a flicker of hope. "If we can get a few more people on our side, we might be able to build a stronger case." As they spread the papers across the table, Emily felt a sense of urgency. They were running out of time. She could only imagine what might happen if Marcus Reed or the hospital administration discovered their plans. She needed to act fast. "I think we should also reach out to some of the other staff," Jessica suggested. "Maybe there are nurses or aides who have seen something suspicious. We can gather more evidence and possibly get more people to back us up." "Great idea," Emily agreed. "But we have to be careful. We can't risk anyone getting wind of what we're doing. If the wrong person hears about this, we could jeopardize everything." They spent the next hour reviewing the documents, discussing their next steps, and strategizing on how to approach their colleagues. Emily felt a surge of gratitude for her friends. They were in this together, and that gave her strength. As they wrapped up their meeting, Emily felt the weight of their plan settling over her like a heavy cloak. They were on the brink of something monumental, and yet the fear of what lay ahead gnawed at her. "Before we go any further, we should consider the possibility of getting legal advice," Margaret said, glancing around the table. "A lawyer could help us understand our rights and guide us on how to proceed without putting ourselves in more danger." Emily nodded slowly. "You're right. We need to protect ourselves. Let's do some research and find a lawyer who specializes in whistleblower cases. Someone who understands the healthcare system and can help us navigate this." Just as they were about to wrap up, Emily's phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a text from David. "Are you okay? I heard you were threatened. I'm worried about you." Emily's heart raced. She had no idea how much David knew about her conversation with Margaret and Jessica. Should she trust him? He was part of the administrative staff, but he was also Margaret's brother. Emily took a breath, weighing her options. "I'm fine, just busy with work. Thanks for checking in." She hit send, then looked up at Margaret and Jessica. "I just got a text from David. He's checking on me." "Is he someone we can trust?" Jessica asked, frowning. "I don't know," Emily admitted. "He's part of the administration, but he's also Margaret's brother. I just don't want to take any chances. Let's keep him at arm's length for now, Margaret suggested. If he really wants to help, he can prove it later. We have to focus on our plan and gathering more evidence. As they finished their meeting, a sense of determination filled the room. They were ready to take on the challenge ahead, but they also knew they needed to remain vigilant. The threat was real, and they were now part of a dangerous game that could have serious consequences. The following morning, Emily arrived at the hospital early. She needed to speak with some of her colleagues discreetly, without raising suspicion. She started with Lisa, a nurse who had been working in the trauma ward for over a decade. Lisa was well respected and had a keen eye for the dynamics of the ward. "Hey, Lisa," Emily said, approaching her at the nurse's station. "Do you have a minute?" Lisa looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "Sure, what's up?" "It's about Marcus Reed in room 414, Emily said, lowering her voice. "I know you've been here long enough to hear some of the stories about him and Tom Mitchell." Lisa's expression shifted, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "What do you know?" Emily glanced around to ensure no one else was within earshot. "I've heard some things about Reed's history, about his attack on Tom. And I'm worried about the current situation. There's a lot we're not being told, and I think it's putting patients at risk." Lisa hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "I know there's something off about it, but I haven't seen anything concrete. It's a tricky situation. Administration is tight-lipped, and I don't want to get caught up in something that could cost me my job." "I understand," Emily said, feeling the weight of the moment. "But if you've seen anything unusual, or if you've heard anything, we need to know. We're gathering evidence, and we could use all the support we can get." Lisa looked conflicted, glancing around the nurse's station again. "I'll think about it. But if you're serious about this, be careful, okay? I don't want you to get in trouble." Emily nodded, grateful for Lisa's willingness to at least consider it. "Thank you. I appreciate it." As she left the nurse's station, Emily's mind raced. She needed to approach more staff members, but she couldn't afford to be reckless. Each conversation carried risks, and she needed to tread carefully. Over the next few days, Emily and her friends continued their efforts, reaching out to trusted colleagues and gathering more evidence. Each time they spoke with someone new, they felt a mixture of hope and dread. The more people they involved, the greater the chance that someone could slip up and expose their plans. One afternoon, as Emily was passing the break room, she overheard a conversation between two nurses, Sarah and Jenna, who were discussing Marcus Reed. Their voices were low, but Emily could hear the tension in their words. "I just don't trust him," Sarah said. "There's something about the way he looks at Tom. It gives me the creeps." "Same," Jenna replied. "I heard about his past. He shouldn't be allowed anywhere near that man. It's like a recipe for disaster." Emily stepped into the break room, her heart racing. "What are you two talking about?" Both nurses turned to her, surprise flashing across their faces. After a brief hesitation, Sarah spoke up. "We were just discussing Marcus Reed. Have you heard anything new about him?" Emily took a deep breath, deciding to seize the opportunity. "Actually, yes. We're concerned about the situation, and we're gathering evidence. If you've seen anything unusual or if you feel uncomfortable, we want to know." Jenna exchanged a glance with Sarah. "We've noticed some strange behavior, but we didn't want to say anything. It seems like administration is trying to sweep everything under the rug." Emily felt a surge of adrenaline. "We need your help. If we can get more witnesses, we might be able to make a stronger case." After a few more moments of discussion, Sarah and Jenna agreed to join their efforts. They exchanged contact information and made plans to meet later that week to share their findings. As Emily left the break room, she felt a renewed sense of determination. With each new ally they gathered, they were building a stronger front against the threats they faced. They were no longer alone in this fight. They had a small army of dedicated nurses ready to stand up for what was right. But as she walked down the corridor, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. They were making progress, yes, but the danger was still very real. She could feel it in the air, like a storm brewing on the horizon. And with every step she took, she knew they were getting closer to a confrontation that would test their resolve and their courage. The days turned into a tense blur as Emily, Margaret, Jessica, and their growing group of allies worked diligently to compile evidence against Marcus Reed and the hospital administration. They met in hushed tones during breaks, exchanging information, documenting unusual occurrences, and gathering testimonies from other staff members who had seen or heard things that didn't sit right. Each meeting felt like stepping deeper into a web of intrigue and danger. Yet Emily felt a sense of purpose driving her forward. They were no longer just nurses. They were whistleblowers, determined to expose the truth. One evening, as Emily was reviewing notes at home, she received a text from Jessica. "We need to meet. It's urgent." Emily's heart raced. She quickly replied and agreed to meet at Margaret's house that evening. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension when she arrived. Margaret and Jessica were already there, both wearing expressions of concern. "What's going on?" Emily asked, settling into a chair. "We've heard something," Jessica said, her voice low. "There's been talk among some of the staff, and it sounds like Reed has been getting visitors. People who shouldn't be here." "Visitors? Who?" Emily asked, her pulse quickening. "Some of them are connected to his family," Margaret said. "We think they might be trying to intimidate staff into keeping quiet about the situation. They've been asking questions, trying to find out who's been talking about Reed." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "So, they're trying to scare people? That's exactly what we feared." "Exactly," Jessica confirmed. "I heard from a couple of aides that they saw a man in a suit visiting Reed. He was asking about the staff, about Tom, and about the situation in general. It sounded like he was trying to figure out who might be a problem for Reed." "We need to be careful," Margaret added. "If they're trying to intimidate people, we could be next. They might already know we're involved in this." "What do we do?" Emily asked, anxiety pooling in her stomach. "We can't let them scare us away from exposing the truth." "We need to gather more evidence," Jessica suggested. "We need to document these visits and see if we can get more information about who these people are. If they're connected to Reed's family, that could be important." Margaret nodded. "We should also talk to Lisa and the others who expressed concern. We need to know if anyone has seen these visitors or noticed anything unusual about Reed recently." As they discussed their next steps, a plan began to take shape. They would gather more testimonies, document the visitor sightings, and continue to build their case against the hospital administration. But they also knew they had to tread carefully. They were stepping into dangerous territory. The following day, Emily returned to the hospital with a renewed sense of determination. She approached Lisa first, hoping to find out if she had seen any visitors in the past few days. "Hey, Lisa," Emily said, catching her in the hallway. "Have you noticed any unusual visitors to room 414? We've heard some rumors. Lisa frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. I haven't seen anyone, but I've heard whispers from the aides. They mentioned seeing a man in a suit a couple of nights ago, asking questions about Reed and Tom. It's got everyone on edge. Do you know who he was? Emily pressed. No, but I'll keep an ear out, Lisa said. If anyone hears anything else, I'll let you know. As Emily moved through the ward, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She approached several other nurses and aides, gathering snippets of information here and there, but it always led back to the same unsettling conclusion. There were people connected to Reed's family, actively trying to intimidate staff. That evening, as Emily met with Margaret and Jessica at Margaret's house, she shared the information she had gathered. We need to be proactive, Emily said, pacing the living room. If Reed's family is sending people in to intimidate us, we need to document everything. Every visit, every conversation. We can't let them spread fear among us. Agreed, Margaret said. But we also need to make sure we're safe. If they're serious about intimidation, we need to think about what that means for us. Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed with a text. It was from David again. I want to help. Meet me tomorrow after your shift. I have information. Emily's heart raced. Could she trust him? He was part of the administration, but he was also Margaret's brother. I just got a text from David, Emily said, showing the message to Margaret and Jessica. He wants to meet tomorrow. Do you think we can trust him? Jessica asked, skepticism in her voice. I don't know, Emily admitted. But if he has information, we need to hear it. We can't turn away any potential allies at this point. Margaret nodded, though her expression remained cautious. Just be careful. If he's playing both sides, we need to make sure we're not putting ourselves in jeopardy. The next day, after a long shift, Emily met David at a small cafe near the hospital. Her heart raced as she entered, scanning the room for him. When she spotted him at a corner table, she approached cautiously. Thanks for meeting me, she said, sliding into the seat across from him. David looked uneasy, glancing around as if he expected someone to overhear. I'm glad you came. I wanted to talk to you about Marcus Reed and what's really going on. What do you know? Emily asked, her pulse quickening. David leaned in, lowering his voice. I overheard some conversations in administration. They're worried about what you and your friends are doing. They know you're gathering evidence, and they're not going to let you get away with it. Emily felt a surge of adrenaline. What do you mean? Are they planning to do something? They're considering a way to discredit you, David said. They might plant false information, make it look like you're the one causing trouble. They'll do anything to protect their reputation. Emily's heart sank. And what about you? Where do you stand in all of this? David hesitated, his eyes darting to the side. I want to help you, but I have to be careful. If they find out I'm talking to you, it could put my job at risk. I'm already walking a fine line just by being here. Then we need to work together, Emily said, leaning forward. We need to find a way to expose the truth without putting you in harm's way. If you can help us gather more information from the inside, it could make all the difference. David nodded slowly. I can do that. But I need you to promise me that you'll be careful. If they catch wind of what we're doing, it could destroy all of us. I promise, Emily said, feeling the weight of the commitment settle on her shoulders. We'll be careful, but we won't back down. As they finished their conversation, Emily felt a mix of hope and dread. They had a new ally in David, someone who could potentially provide critical information. But the looming threat from Reed's family and the hospital administration was still very real. When she returned home that night, Emily's mind raced with the possibilities. They had to act fast, but every decision now carried heightened stakes. The walls were closing in, and she could sense the danger lurking just out of sight. As she prepared for bed, Emily's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Margaret. "We need to meet ASAP." Something happened.